Welcome to today's lecture on Investigating Inequalities, Part 2. Presently, we are discussing the evolution of Varna and caste hierarchy. So, if we talk about the period from 8th century onwards, there was an encounter with Islam, and from 8th to 11th centuries, there were new rulers who did not accept the hierarchical ideology that was prevalent in Indian society. However, Varna continued to remain an important component of political power at local levels, and because of the rising threat of Islamic influence, there were in fact more rigid rules that were imposed against interdining as well as intermarriage. So, there was now a greater discouragement of intercaste marriages, both the Anulom as well as Pratilom marriages. Now, coming to the colonial period and with the onset of the British rule, so what was the colonial construction, or in what ways the colonial construction of caste system was different, or did it make any difference to the system that was prevalent? British rule helped in evolving an understanding of the caste ideology. British administrators and scholars called Orientalists represented caste as fundamentally different from other hierarchical ideas, as they considered these hierarchical ideas being primarily class oriented in the Western civilization. So, they understood caste only from Brahmanical textual sources, that is mainly the Dharam Shastras, and therefore, the Hindu religious texts were important source material for them in order to develop a discourse around the caste. So, they attempted the othering of the colonized and projected the colonial society as exotic, as different, and most important, in need of Western enlightened rule. So, most of the narrative that they built around understanding or explaining the caste system was around this theme. So, in 1833, when British declared that no person on account of his religion, place of birth, descent, color would be disabled from holding any office or employment, this definitely facilitated equality in terms of access to education and jobs. However, another very important trend that started under the colonial rule was that of census and policies and laws that were based on the idea of caste hierarchy, census and elections, etc., reinforced a more redefined and clear cut idea of caste, and hence caste and Varna were made a lived reality for Indians. Colonial education taught this notion of caste to Indians. So, caste in fact came to be reified and labeled. So, this labeling of castes that also went in the census records further created a tendency among the Indians to consider themselves as belonging to a particular caste or not belonging to a particular caste, but then they did consider themselves as part of the caste system. So, the colonial administration in course of its attempt to establish law and order also created entities like criminal and martial races or criminal and martial castes. So, patriarchy also was reinforced largely on account of believing the textual traditions of Dharam Shastras or Smriti literature as religious laws, thereby governing a religious minded population. So overall, it created a much greater fixity in ideas and practices around the Varna Jati and completely overlooked whatever fluidity had existed in the past. Now, colonialism also raised the issue of rights, and paradoxically one can say that colonialism also created a narrow space for the articulation of rights by lower caste groups. So, a systematic ordering of all jatis into the same varna led to several several petitions challenging colonial ordering. So, this again kind of created or gave rise to a competition among different jatis, and they wanted to be identified with specific varnas. So, therefore, we can say that there was greater reification and legitimization of caste. Some jatis claimed a higher varna status based on the purity of their customs, which often resulted in seclusion of and restrictions upon women of these jatis, because in again one can refer to Sanskritization here, that how it was considered that just like women belonging to the upper varnas or the upper jatis, they are not mobile, they are homebound, and hence they have a certain degree of respect in society. So similarly, if we impose these kind of restrictions on women of our families, then automatically there would be some kind of respectability that would be earned. However, we also have references to Jyotiba Phule and how his Satya Shodhak Samaj attacked the very foundation of the hierarchical principle of caste. This encouraged creation of supra-local identities that were based on the colonial interpretation of Varna Jati to some extent, but they were different from the much more localized sense of identity that had earlier been the case. So, now there was some kind of a pan-Indian mobilization for fighting for the rights and fighting for justice. Now, colonial regime and the changes, the economic changes that happened henceforth also encouraged new occupations. There were urban centers that were emerging, and these changes also undermined the traditional economic basis of jati rankings. Now, the next important stage that is the post-colonial period, let us now see what was the attitude of nationalist ideology and how the national movement kind of considered the issue of caste and the issue of rights. Most nationalists were upper caste men, and they imagined the nation in those terms, as most secular liberal nationalists were Brahmins, and it was this category specifically which continued to have its influence even in the post-colonial, even during the post-colonial politics. So their vision was challenged in the 19th century by leaders like Jyotiba Phule, and in the 20th century by a variety of anti-Brahmin movements, and specifically by Dr. Bhimrao Ambedkar. And it was these social reformers who were committed to overthrowing the caste system altogether rather than reforming it. So, if we now consider the different approach of leaders like Gandhi and Ambedkar to the issue of caste or Varna, then we can say that Mahatma Gandhi's idea of Varnashram Dharam as a harmonious system of interdependence favored the continuation of the system, but he was very critical of the practice of untouchability, and therefore in order to do away or in order to kind of overlook the harm that had been done to the untouchables so far, he coined the term Harijans or children of God to describe this Varna. Ambedkar, however, found Gandhi and other elitist nationalists as patronizing, and he wanted to end the caste system altogether rather than reforming it. So he organized them politically and coined the term Dalit, that is the broken or oppressed. So he did not want any kind of eyewash to take place by not considering this particular group of people as who had suffered in the past. So now after independence, as you all know, the constitution that came into effect from 1950 onwards, this was the single most far reaching and revolutionary change which brought about equality of all citizens. And Ambedkar, along with several other important activists and political leaders, played a very important role in shaping the draft. So therefore, now affirmative action policies, that is reservations for Dalits to compensate for historically enforced deprivation, was considered as the need of the hour, and it was introduced. And as products of colonialism, most liberals saw caste as a sign of backwardness, as they never had faced the inequities of caste discrimination. And so the leaders believed that probably with modernization, with greater economic growth and development, with newer avenues that would be created, automatically the caste system would die down, and the caste system would simply disappear with modernization, though electoral politics demanded the inclusion of lower caste groups in the political process, and this was seen as a major step that would definitely empower this group. The barriers between the subcastes considerably weakened in the 20th century, and the Indian Constitution proclaimed the principle of equality to all the citizens and abolished the practice of untouchability. Now coming to a comparative analysis of Ambedkar and Nehru, there we can say that there existed some commonalities in approach, as both were committed to social justice. But Ambedkar was very clear that caste needed to be tackled head on rather than ignored in the hope that it would disappear with modernization, with greater economic development, with the way India was going to progress. So they both also disagreed over Hindu Code Bill. So there was now an increasing talk about allowing intercaste marriage, divorce, equal rights for wives, sisters and daughters of a family. So as a father of the Indian Constitution, there are some important benchmarks that were devised by Ambedkar, and in fact as early as 1932 Ambedkar had mentioned, our fight is to claim our basic human rights and dignity. So this is how a practical approach was being devised, and the famous slogan of Ambedkar was educate, organize and agitate. So he was not demanding simply to modernize. What he was demanding was some kind of a practical approach, that unless and until the lower castes get educated, and unless and until they organize themselves and also they agitate in the sense that they raise issues that are important and they fight for a just human society, nothing is going to change. However, Ambedkar remained disillusioned, and through a public renunciation he converted to Buddhism shortly before his death in 1956. Then another very important linkage that one can talk about is the linkage between caste and class. So, by class here it means economic power, and this overlap between class and caste is existing, and it has existed in India due to three important factors. So, these are access to land, access to education, as well as access to valued skills or commodity. And so therefore, unless and until these categories are taken care of, and this kind of discrimination even in economic terms is taken care of, we cannot really think about an end to the social discrimination. So, basically cultural, political, economic, social, all these factors and aspects need to be taken care of if one has to deal with the issue of caste discrimination. Now, I would also be talking about how there was a distinct identity formation which started from pre-colonial period onwards. So, during the from medieval period onwards, there was a formation, there was a creation of a new kind of political order, the establishment of Delhi Sultanate, and after that the Mughal dynasty. So, there was a clear cut authoritarianism that was emerging at the political level, and there was also an expansion of agrarian society and the emergence of pan-regional market economy. So, there were unique ways of articulating individual as well as collective identities, noting differences, formulating, displaying and reproducing socio-economic inequalities therefore came into being. And there was a clear-cut interrelationship between caste, class and patriarchy. Caste emerged as a system of exploitation of not only the unprivileged but also the women. So, evolution of caste society is to be linked with the building of class society and also with the stabilization of patriarchal and gender exploitation. As has been pointed out by Upinder Singh, the political history of ancient India was increasingly based on political violence. So, there were wars, there were power struggles, there were conflicts between the state as well as the tribals, between the state and the forest people. There was caste, class oppression, there were crimes and severe punishments, and there was violence within the family. So, all these different developments and these realities must be taken care of when one is talking about the evolution of the caste system. There was inequality and oppression on the basis of class, caste and gender. Now, next we would be dealing with the writings of Subira Jaiswal and how Subira Jaiswal has studied an elite community of priests and rulers who made use of symbols in their class interests, specifically with reference to the early Indian history. So, Subira Jaiswal has revealed the agency of elite classes who produced religious literature and ritual to legitimate hierarchy, to legitimize their authority. Subira has taken a long period of history into account, that is from Rig Vedic period onwards, in order to develop this kind of a explanation. So, she has undertaken interpretation of several myths. Why myths are considered important? Because myths reveal stories of domination and resistance. So, there was development of religion as a socio-cultural religious system that favored some and oppressed others. So, she has kind of explored origins and functions of caste system along with the analysis of power and ethnicity. So, in this scheme of things, endogamy came to be seen as a perpetuation of caste hierarchy. So, according to Jaiswal, caste and Varna system were important tools that were employed by the elite to naturalize hierarchy and to ensure power and domination. And by elite here I mean the two upper Varnas. So, during this part of history, Varna system was not based on race or ethnicity and was largely functional, especially during the Rig Vedic period. One can say that Varna system was largely functional, and it was in this functional system that endogamy came to be adopted as a gendered device to ensure endurance of caste and class privileges on a hereditary basis. So, therefore, since this system was very beneficial for the two upper Varnas, so therefore, it was but natural and logical that its perpetuation would be attempted going forward. And in this, endogamy played a very important role. Then there was also a reference to the karma theory and how the Upanishadic rationale of karma and rebirth made birth in higher Varnas a result of good deeds or meritorious acts that had been performed in the previous birth. So, the elites served their own material interests by justifying inequality on the basis of this theory and on the basis of past actions in the past birth. So, gradually what was emerging was some kind of a philosophical tool, and this philosophy masked economic and political motivations underlying socio-religious hierarchies. So, therefore, developing a philosophy, developing this and projecting this philosophy as part of the religious literature became a very important device in order to promote and in order to harden these socio-religious hierarchies. And as has been pointed out by R.S. Sharma, roots of socio-religious hierarchy are material, grounded in control of production, with the last Varna coming into existence as a class of servile labor. So, this was the whole function of creating this last Varna, who would always be ready to perform the labor for the upper two Varnas. And as has been pointed out by Jaiswal, this linkage between patriarchy and a stratified inegalitarian society must be analyzed. So, gender and the development of patriarchy in early Brahmanism as well as during the period of Kautilyan Arthashastra needs to be studied from this standpoint. And by 7th century BCE, patriarchy was well established. Women had been reduced to objects serving the interests of one lineage or the other. And during the Rig Vedic period, while women still enjoyed freedom to choose their spouse and freedom over their sexuality, however, there was disappearance of even this freedom from later Vedic period onwards, as the control of female sexuality and its subordination became the essential prerequisites for curtailing power and privileges, which resulted in endogamy. So, therefore, now there emerged greater patriarchal control of gender, and as has been pointed out by Jaiswal, the entire structure of caste depended on patriarchal control of gender, which ensured continuance of sharp boundaries between different Varnas, promoting hierarchy between the exploited as well as the exploiting classes. Women and girls thus came to be perceived as objects and treated as property. Hence the use of the term Kanyadan. So they were exchanged among men who were suspicious of Varna Sankara or Kali Yuga. And it was in this background that a very specific image of a Pativrata Nari was developed. So women were made utterly dependent on men, leading to cultivation of this ideology. And as has been portrayed in Arthashastra, the women as productive labor force have been mentioned, but even such women operated within the realms of hegemonic masculinity, and women's insecurity and poverty in the earlier times and especially during the during their old age proved their dependence on men in an otherwise economy of pleasure and power. So therefore we need to take into consideration all these factors that created some kind of a cultural hegemony. Thank you.